for Phil Twyford.
If there was ever any doubt about the Honourable Simon Bridges, that contribution he just made in the House puts to rest any doubt that he has well and truly drunk the Kool-Aid. And he got up and made actually not a very good defence of the government's policy on social housing. He showed a lack of understanding of the detail and really just kind of parroted the most superficial lines that he gets from Paula Bennett about what's really going on with this social housing policy. Here's the big lie. Here's the big lie about national social housing policy. They want the country to believe that it's all about making homes warm and dry, that it's about innovation, that it's about giving power to the community. We heard Simon Bridges say that local communities can always do it better than someone in Wellington making all the decisions. So it's dressed up in the language of empowerment, of community, and of kind of modernising the housing stock. It is nothing about those things. Let's talk about what's really going on here. And Bill English basically was caught candidly telling the truth to the New Zealand Herald back in November last year when he said the purpose of this policy is simply to get rid of state houses off the government books. He thinks it's a lazy use of capital for the government to even own housing. He wants someone else to own the houses. He doesn't care who. He said that on the record. He said we can sell them to anyone. It could be the Salvation Army, could be property developers. He doesn't care who they sell them to. He simply wants to get the government out of the business of owning houses. The model the National Party wants to move to is one where anybody can own the houses and the state will simply pay a direct subsidy into the pockets of landlords. It's the accommodation supplement on steroids. And it's exactly what happened under Margaret Thatcher in Britain and countless other countries around the Western world. Bill English likes to get up in this House and say, oh, we're old-fashioned in New Zealand, it's time we caught up with the rest of the world. Well, I'll tell you, Mr. Chairman, what has happened in much of the Western world in the last 20 years. The state, under right-wing governments, has retreated from the provision of social housing for the most vulnerable citizens in society and has handed that job over to the market. It is rolling back the lessons that were learnt all around the world in the 20th century, that the market alone will never deliver a sufficient quantity of decent housing for society's most vulnerable citizens. But that is what this government is doing, and they've said it. Nick Smith said it, his officials have said it. The point of this ideological burp, as Annette King has described this policy, is to try to create an artificial market in social housing. As Grant Robertson said, this is Bill English going back to the 1990s, when National introduced market rents and flogged off 13,000 state houses that ended up in the hands of property developers and private landlords. This is simply a continuation of that neoliberal quest that Bill English has to get the government out of the business of providing social housing. We can look at the behaviour, rather than listening to the mealy-mouthed platitudes of Paula Bennett, we can actually look at National's behaviour to judge whether in fact they are seriously interested in providing more decent housing for New Zealand's most vulnerable people. Let's look at what they've actually done rather than listening to their rhetoric. Since they've been in government, they have stripped Housing New Zealand of its core functions. It is now, as we've been saying, simply a state-owned version of Barfoot and Thompson. It is no more than a letting agency, and this bill, Mr. Chairman, takes away one of the last kind of vestigial functions of Housing New Zealand, and that is its ability to do research, to evaluate its programs, and to advise the government of the day on social housing. They've sold down housing all over the country. In fact, mostly what they're doing is they're shifting state houses out of regional New Zealand into the north. They're taking state houses away from Dunedin, away from Gisborne, away from Palmerston North, and that they're stripping out a valuable social and economic asset, Mr. Chairman, from regional New Zealand. They are not, Mr. Chairman, they are not building any new state houses. And more than anything, that gives the lie to the rhetoric of Paula Bennett and Bill English. In the middle of a housing crisis, in the middle of a housing shortage, when people are living in cars and garages, they are not doing the obvious thing, and that is increasing the supply of housing and building more houses. The national government is using Housing New Zealand as a cash cow in the middle of a housing crisis. They've taken $500 million in dividends out of our country's main social housing agency, and that money's gone straight back into the consolidated account. And when Bill English was asked, what are you going to do with the proceeds of from the sale of state houses? Are you going to build more houses with them? He said, no, why would we do that? We don't want more state houses.
He used to say that.
What's the point?
He said that until 2008.
Yep, he did, and then he's changed his tune. They've also tightened the eligibility criteria so tight that even the poorest people in this country cannot even get on the priority waiting list for Housing New Zealand. And every MP on this side of the House who represents their community knows there is massive unmet social need, there is hardship, there is poverty in our communities. People can't even get in the door because they have to ring up an 0800 number. But worse than that, they have no prospect of getting on the Housing New Zealand waiting list because this government has tightened the eligibility criteria in a cynical move to simply cut the waiting lists. And the effect of that policy has been that there are 3,000 vacant state houses sitting around this country while people languish in expensive, cold, damp, substandard rentals. There are thousands of vacant state houses. And that completely gives the lie to Paula Bennett's claim that this government is about housing more people and looking after the tenants. It is a manufactured crisis where they leave dozens and dozens of empty state houses sitting boarded up and attracting graffiti in regional centres all around New Zealand. And that is the excuse that they use for then selling off those houses.
Even in Christchurch.
And we know, Mr. Chairman, that Housing New Zealand has been offloading these state houses all around New Zealand in every regional centre, town and city around this country, significantly below the government value, flicking them off with no regard for the taxpayers' value, and selling them straight into the hands of property developers and private landlords. That is what this government is all about. They've subjected hundreds of tenants to the needless anxiety and stress, including families with young children, the elderly and the disabled, notwithstanding the fact that Nick Smith stood in this House 4 years ago and promised that he wouldn't do that. They broke that promise. They are throwing people out on the street because they have committed the crime of earning enough to pay a market rent in state housing. These are the policies that the national government is implementing in social housing. They are destroying the dream in this country that people should be able to have a decent roof over their heads no matter how much they earn. And Paula Bennett and John Key stand in this House, I don't know how they can do it, how they can stand up with a straight face to dismantle and dismember the very system of social support that gave them a decent start in their life. It was okay for the taxpayer to give John Key and his mother a decent house in Christchurch in the 1960s that gave him a start in life. But now, apparently, according to the National Party, state house tenants are the undeserving poor. They demonise them, they parody state house tenants. Nick Smith gets up and says there's Mercedes-Benzes parked out in front of state houses, and that's the political cover that the National Party uses to destroy the system of state housing in this country. This bill gives flexible purchasing arrangements. What a euphemism. It gives the minister wide discretionary powers to do sweetheart deals with property developers so that they can flick off billions of dollars of state houses. They don't care who they sell them to, they want to get rid of them by hook or by crook. And the current arrangements that they have where they can pay an income-related rent subsidy, the difference between a market rent and a social rent, that's what gets paid to Housing New Zealand. But they haven't been able to sell off these houses to the Methodist Mission, to the Salvation Army or anybody else. This bill is their get-out-of-jail-free card. It enables them to flick off those houses and do sweetheart deals with property developers.
Tracy Martin.
Thank you, Mr. Chair.